On a freezing night in Chicago, a homeless black man stood shivering at a bus stop, clutching a stack of soaked papers with a look of despair after dozens of failed job applications. Suddenly, a woman came running toward him in a thin business suit. She was trembling violently, rubbing her bare hands together in desperation. Without hesitation, the man took off his only coat and handed it to her. A small yet deeply compassionate act that he had no idea would change both of their lives forever. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow I have something special just for you. The wind tore through the deserted streets of South Side Chicago like a blade slicing across the empty bus stop where Gilbert Brown stood, hunched in the flickering half-light of a broken street lamp. Snow swirled around his boots, a relentless, quiet enemy that piled against his legs and soaked through the frayed seams of his coat. He tightened his grip around a battered manila folder tucked against his chest, the thin paper inside his last few resumes barely offering any protection against the night's gnawing hunger. Gilbert was 47 years old, a former structural engineer, a widower, a father clinging to what pieces remained of a life that had once been built on firm ground. Now he waited for a bus that might never come under a sky that seemed too heavy with gray to ever lift. Across the street, a neon pharmacy sign blinked 9:02 p.m., its dull red light bleeding into the whiteness of the storm. Gilbert shifted his weight from foot to foot, feeling the cold bite deeper, not just into his body, but into that hollow place inside where hope had once lived. His fingers, cracked and raw from too many nights spent braving the elements, trembled slightly as he adjusted the folder, careful not to let the wind tear it from him. Inside were pieces of himself. His degrees, his experience, the polite letters saying, "Thank you, but no thank you," in language more sterile than a hospital room. He breathed out slowly, watching his breath cloud and vanish into the night air like a ghost. He heard her before he saw her, the hurried, uneven click of heels against pavement, a sound nearly swallowed by the snow. Gilbert turned his head slightly enough to catch sight of a woman staggering toward the bus stop, clutching a leather purse against her chest. Hair plastered wet to her cheeks by the blowing snow. She wore no coat, just a business skirt and thin blouse, utterly unsuited to a night like this. Her face, flushed red from cold, was sharp and striking even in the dim light, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps as she ducked under the narrow shelter, shivering violently. Gilbert stiffened instinctively, drawing back into himself. He had learned over the past few years that people like her did not want to be approached by men like him, men who wore their bad luck like a second skin. Still, he couldn't help but glance at her from the corner of his eye. She rubbed her bare hands together desperately, arms wrapped tight around her slim frame, her teeth chattering audibly. Gilbert's first instinct, honed by months of looking out for no one but himself, was to keep still, keep quiet, mind his own business. But when a brutal gust of wind howled through the stop and she flinched visibly, recoiling from the force of it, something deep inside Gilbert moved, a stubborn, aching place he hadn't allowed himself to feel from in a long time. He looked down at his coat, thin, worn to the lining, barely enough to keep the cold at bay, and yet it was something. It was what he had. And at that moment, it was enough. Without thinking, without ceremony, Gilbert shrugged out of his coat. The cold hit him instantly, like diving headfirst into freezing water. He gritted his teeth, pushing past the instinct to cling to what little he had. He stepped toward her, holding the coat out in his calloused hands. The woman blinked, startled, her eyes wide and wary as he approached. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice breaking from cold, and perhaps something else, surprise maybe, distrust. Gilbert gave a small, tired smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, but was honest just the same. "I don't have much left to give," he said, simply, voice low and steady, "but this I can give." She hesitated, pride and desperation warring on her face. She opened her mouth to refuse again, then stopped because the wind came roaring back, and for a moment she looked so small and fragile standing there shivering in the storm that even stubbornness had to yield to survival. Still, Gilbert made the decision for her. Gently, without waiting for her permission, he draped the coat over her shoulders. It hung heavy and awkward on her, but she clutched it tight, pulling it around herself like armor. She looked up at him, her mouth forming words that her breath couldn't quite keep up with. "Thank you," she whispered. Gilbert nodded once curtly, then stepped back, folding his arms across his chest against the fresh onslaught of cold. They stood like that, side by side under the crooked shelter, two strangers bound not by words, but by an unspoken understanding that on a night like this, the simplest kindness could mean everything. And then as he bent his head against the snow, he heard it, the sound of paper fluttering away, thin and desperate as dry leaves in the wind. He turned sharply to see his manila folder slipped loose from his grip, torn open by the blizzard, resumes scattered across the icy sidewalk, tumbling end over end through the darkness. For a second, Gilbert just stood there frozen, not from cold this time, but from the sick realization that his last threads of hope were flying into the void. Then slowly, methodically, he began to move, stepping out from the shelter, reaching for the papers. Each one was a little more ruined than the last water soaking through the thin typewritten lines that had once told the story of a man with a steady job, a mortgage, a family. April, because that was her name, though he did not know it, yet watched him, her hands clutching his coat tighter around herself. She opened her mouth as if to speak, to apologize, to help, perhaps, but no words came. There was nothing she could say that would not sound hollow against the gravity of what was happening. Gilbert crouched low in the snow, gathering the sodden papers with rough, careful hands. His breath fogged in the air, slow and steady, as he pressed them back into the ruined folder. When he returned to the shelter, his fingers stiff and red, he caught her watching him, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite name. Pity maybe, but not the condescending kind. Something more honest, something raw. "I'm sorry," she said finally, voice small. Gilbert shrugged, that tired smile flickering across his face again. "It's just paper," he said. "I can print more. As long as I'm standing, I can start again." They stood in silence, listening to the wind whip against the steel frame of the bus stop. Neither of them said another word. There was no need. Sometimes the most powerful conversations are the ones that happen in silence between people who recognize something broken, something brave in one another. Somewhere far down the street, headlights cut through the falling snow, the low rumble of a late bus breaking the stillness. Gilbert glanced at it, then at the woman beside him. She clutched his coat a little tighter, as if afraid that if she let go, she might vanish into the storm. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his. But somehow, standing there beneath the broken light, wrapped in a coat that smelled faintly of soap and old coffee, they were no longer strangers. They were survivors. The bus hissed to a stop, its doors creaking open. She turned to him, hesitating. "What's your name?" she asked. "Gilbert," he answered, voice rough but steady. "I'm April," she said. He smiled again, softer this time. "Stay warm, April." She nodded, stepping onto the bus, then turning back one last time, the coat heavy on her shoulders. Their eyes met through the drifting snow. Something passed between them, something unseen but undeniable. As the bus pulled away, Gilbert stood alone at the stop, the snow piling around his boots, the ruined folder clutched under his arm. He shivered, but it was no longer only from the cold. It was from the small, quiet certainty that something had shifted in the universe, something that could not be undone. He looked up into the heavy gray sky, flakes melting against his lashes, and whispered to no one, "Maybe tomorrow." And then, gathering himself against the relentless winter, Gilbert Brown turned and walked into the night. The bus's red taillights vanished into the storm, swallowed by the thickening snow, leaving Gilbert Brown alone at the stop, the battered manila folder pressed protectively against his side. For a long moment he didn't move. The cold gnawed at him sharper now, without his coat slipping beneath his clothes, seeping into his bones. But he remained there, rooted, staring down the empty road, as if waiting for something more than a bus, something he couldn't name. When nothing came but the wind, he turned, gathering what remained of his dignity and his ruined papers, and began the long trudge back through the silent streets of Chicago's South Side. His boots, long since worn thin, crunched through the deepening snow. Each step was slow, methodical, not because of exhaustion, though it weighed heavily on him, but because he had learned over these past few years that there was no need to rush when there was nothing waiting for you at the end of the walk. Around him, the city slept uneasily under a heavy, snow-laden sky, neon signs flickering against the blizzard, casting long, distorted reflections on the wet pavement. Gilbert moved like a shadow among them, unnoticed, unimportant, unseen. At the edge of a forgotten industrial block, hidden behind crumbling brick warehouses and rusted chain-link fences, sat his old pickup truck, a 1998 Chevy that had once carried his family to weekend picnics and school plays. Now it was home shelter coffin. He brushed the snow from the windshield with a numbed hand and pulled open the stiff door, climbing inside. The interior was freezing, his breath misting instantly in the air. The blankets he kept on the seat were thin, the heater long dead, but he wrapped one around his shoulders anyway, if only for the comfort of the motion. From the glove box, he pulled a battered tin box, the latch sticking, before giving way with a reluctant pop. Inside were his treasures, a photograph of Lily still laughing at some unseen joke, her hair wild in the summer sun, and another of Hugo at 7, missing his 2 front teeth, his grin uncontainable. Gilbert traced the worn edges with a rough fingertip, the motion slow, reverent. These were his anchors, the proof that he had once built, more than buildings, that he had once built a life. The memories came unbidden, vivid, even against the encroaching fog of cold and fatigue. He saw himself hard hat, on blueprints rolled under his arm, walking into job sites with pride. He saw Lily standing in their tiny kitchen, dancing barefoot to an old radio while stirring a pot of chili. He saw Hugo wobbling on his first bike, looking back with shining eyes to make sure his dad was watching. They had been happy once. Not rich, but rich enough where it mattered, until the diagnosis shattered their world in one brutal sentence. Stage 4, unstoppable. Gilbert had left his job the day after they got the news. No hesitation, no regret. He spent 9 months caring for Lily, watching her fade, fighting battles with insurance companies by day and demons by night. The savings dried up, the house sold to cover debts, the car repossessed, but none of it mattered next to the way Lily's hand would squeeze his, even in her weakest moments. A silent thank you for staying. After she was gone, there was only Hugo and Gilbert, and a mountain of sorrow he couldn't climb. They moved from one cramped apartment to another, the spaces growing smaller and colder, the windows closer to the street. When Hugo's caseworker finally came citing unsafe conditions, Gilbert had been too tired to fight, too broken. He had signed the papers with a shaking hand, kissed his son's forehead, and whispered a promise he barely believed anymore. Just for now, buddy. Just for now. The wind rattled the truck like a giant hand shaking the frame, but Gilbert barely noticed. He tucked the photographs back into their tin resting place and pulled the blanket tighter. The memory of the woman at the bus stop drifted back unbidden, the way she had clutched his coat, the way her eyes wide with shock, and something like gratitude had met his for that one suspended moment. He hadn't given her the coat to earn anything. It hadn't even been a decision, not really. It was just what you did when you still had a piece of your soul left, even when it cost you. Maybe especially then. Not far away in the heart of the city's glittering towers, April Jones stood alone in her penthouse, the heavy silence pressing down on her like an invisible hand. She had shed her wet heels by the door, but hadn't yet moved beyond the foyer, still wrapped tightly in the rough, oversized coat Gilbert had given her. Her fingers, numb from more than cold, brushed against the worn fabric, tracing the seams and patches with an absent tenderness. She had grown used to silence over the years, learned to dress it up with white noise television music, the hum of busy schedules. But tonight, the silence was different. It was honest. It filled every corner of the high-ceilinged rooms with a hollowness she couldn't ignore. April drifted to the living room, sinking into the edge of the sleek leather couch, and reached into the coat's inner pocket, her fingers closing around something crinkled and soft. She pulled it out slowly, unfolding the worn paper to reveal a child's drawing. 2 stick figures standing under a crooked yellow sun labeled simply Daddy and Me, a red heart floating between them. At the bottom, scrawled in wobbly, innocent letters, the words, "I love you, Daddy Hugo." The world tilted. April pressed the paper to her chest, a sob catching in her throat. She bit down on it hard, forcing the sound back. She hadn't cried in years, hadn't dared, not since she was a little girl sitting on the cold stone steps of a church, one frozen night, alone and unwanted. Her mother gone, her father, a memory never spoken aloud. She had huddled there in the dark, too proud to cry for help, too scared to hope. She had been wearing a thin jacket that night, barely more than a sweater against the brutal Chicago wind. And then, out of the swirling darkness, he had come. Alan. An old man, his face lined with time and kindness, had spotted her there. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He had simply shrugged off his own battered coat and draped it over her shoulders. She remembered the smell of its soap wood smoke, something grounding and real. He had sat down beside her without a word, sharing his warmth until the night gave way to morning. By then he was gone, vanished into the waking city, leaving behind only the coat and the first small ember of belief that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't entirely cruel. That coat had stayed with her through years of foster homes, dorm rooms, and first apartments. It had been old and threadbare by the time she let it go, but it had done its work. It had shielded her not just from the cold, but from despair. Now, wrapped in another man's coat, feeling the same aching gratitude she hadn't felt since that long ago night, April realized just how far she had traveled from that scared girl and how much of that journey had cost her pieces of herself she hadn't even noticed losing. She thought about Delbert then, about the carefully scheduled dinners, the polished smiles at company galas, the constant justifications for absence, for indifference, about how he had called her that evening, voice brisk and distracted, to tell her he couldn't make it to dinner, that an emergency board meeting had come up, that she should understand. Of course she understood. She always did. Their whole relationship had been built on understanding that work came first, that sacrifices had to be made. She had understood last month when he missed her promotion celebration. She had understood last week when he forgot their anniversary. She understood tonight when he left her standing outside a shuttered office building, heels sinking into snow, while he negotiated some new merger she would read about in the papers tomorrow. It had been Gilbert Brown, a man with nothing to gain, who had looked at her and simply acted. April wiped her eyes with the sleeve of Gilbert's coat and looked out over the city, its lights blurred by the storm. Somewhere out there in the vast, indifferent sprawl of streets and steel was a man who had reminded her in a single, selfless gesture that kindness was still real, still alive. She didn't know yet what she was going to do about it, but she knew with a clarity sharper than the winter air against her skin that she couldn't go back to pretending she didn't need it. The storm raged through the night, hammering the city with wind and snow. But inside her penthouse, April Jones sat wide awake, the rough fabric of Gilbert's coat draped around her shoulders, the crumpled drawing of a little boy and his father clutched tight in her hands. Sleep would not come. It wasn't just the lingering cold from her time outside. It was the restless ache that had taken root somewhere deep inside her, a feeling she hadn't named in years, perhaps had forgotten how to name altogether. She sat by the window watching the whiteout consume the skyline, thinking not of board meetings or shareholder reports, but of a man she had barely met, a man who had seen her when no one else had bothered to look. When dawn broke, a thin, pale gray light seeping over the frozen city, April had already made up her mind. She rose, moving with the decisive calm she reserved for mergers and acquisitions, and dialed Amelia's number. Her assistant answered on the second ring, voice still groggy with sleep. "I need you to help me find someone," April said, her tone quiet but firm. There was a pause, a hesitation laced with the unspoken awareness that April never made such requests lightly. "Of course," Amelia replied, fully alert now. "Who are we looking for?" "I don't have much," April admitted. "His name is Gilbert. He was at the 45th and Halstead bus stop last night around 9. He gave me his coat." She hesitated, feeling suddenly foolish, but pressed on. "He's important." Amelia didn't ask for clarification, didn't press for explanations. That was why April trusted her. "I'll start pulling traffic camera footage and cross-reference bus schedules. Give me a few hours." "Thank you," April said, softer than she intended. The day unfolded slowly, painfully, as April sat through meetings she barely heard, answered emails she barely read. Her mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the image of Gilbert standing in the snow, shivering without his coat, clutching that battered folder to his chest, like it was all he had left in the world. She wondered what had driven a man like that, because it was obvious to her that he had once been someone with pride, with purpose, to such a place. And she wondered with a growing sense of urgency whether he still believed in anything at all. By mid-afternoon, Amelia called back. "I found him," she said, her voice low with the gravity of the discovery. "There's a 1998 Chevy truck parked behind an abandoned warehouse on South Racine. Matches the description you gave. He's been seen coming and going from there." April didn't hesitate. "Text me the address." "You want me to send someone with you?" "No," April said. This is personal." Bundled against the cold, April drove herself across the city, steering her black sedan through streets still heavy with last night's snowfall. The neighborhoods grew rougher the farther south she traveled. The storefronts shuttered, graffiti creeping up cracked brick walls, sidewalks empty, but for the occasional figure huddled against the wind. She pulled up in front of the warehouse, engine idling, and spotted the truck immediately, a rusted, battered thing that sagged on its tires like an old workhorse ready to collapse. The windows were frosted over, but through the glass she could just make out a figure sitting hunched behind the wheel. For a moment doubt gnawed at her. What was she doing here, dressed in her tailored coat and leather boots, intruding into a life she barely understood? But then she thought of the drawing folded carefully on her nightstand, of the way Gilbert had looked at her, not as a burden, not as an opportunity, but simply as another human being in need, and she pushed the door open. The cold hit her like a slap, but she ignored it, picking her way carefully across the ice and snow until she stood beside the truck. She rapped lightly on the driver's side window. Inside, Gilbert stirred, his head snapped up, eyes blinking against the light confusion clouding his features. He wiped at the glass with the sleeve of his jacket peering out, and when he recognized her, the confusion deepened into wariness. April offered a small, uncertain smile. She could see the questions racing behind his guarded gaze. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" She lifted her hand, slightly palms open, a universal gesture of peace. "Hi, Gilbert," she said, her breath misting in the air between them. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." He hesitated a moment longer, then leaned over to manually unlock the door. The handle creaked as she pulled it open, the interior of the truck releasing a gust of stale, cold air. Gilbert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, making space without knowing exactly why. "I wanted to say thank you," April said, properly. Gilbert shrugged his shoulders tight with discomfort. "No need. It was just a coat." "It wasn't," April said quietly, and something in her voice made him pause. They sat there a moment, the silence stretching, not uncomfortable, but dense with things unspoken. "I don't have much," Gilbert said finally, his voice low and rough. "I can't give you anything else." "I'm not here for anything else," April replied. "I'm here because I don't want to forget what it felt like standing there thinking no one would notice and having someone prove me wrong." Gilbert looked away, out the frost-rimmed windshield. He was not a man accustomed to being thanked, to being acknowledged. "Would you have a cup of coffee with me?" April asked, her voice lighter, almost shy. Gilbert blinked at her, genuinely surprised. "I know a place just a few blocks from here," she added quickly. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm." For a long beat, Gilbert sat silent, weighing something invisible in the space between them. Then slowly he nodded. "Okay," he said, "but I'm buying. Least I can do." April smiled, and it wasn't the polished, professional smile she wore at corporate functions. It was smaller, softer, more real. "I'll allow it," she said. They drove separately, her sedan trailing his rattling pickup at a cautious distance. The diner was a relic from another era, a chrome and neon holdout against the sprawling decay of the neighborhood. Inside, the heat was stifling, and the coffee strong enough to peel paint. They took a booth near the back, Gilbert shrugging out of his jacket, April sliding into the seat opposite him. For a while, they simply sat nursing their coffees, the silence between them companionable rather than strained. April asked about Hugo, and Gilbert's face, normally so guarded, lit up in a way that made her chest ache. He spoke of his son with a pride that no amount of hardship had managed to extinguish. His words, simple, but laced with a quiet, stubborn hope. She told him in turn about her work, about the company she had built from scratch, about the long, lonely climb to the top. She didn't speak of Delbert. Some things she realized were better left unsaid when honesty mattered. They talked until the sky outside turned from gray to charcoal, until the waitress began wiping down counters with a look that clearly said she was ready to close up. April paid the check without argument, and together they stepped back into the frigid night. At the curb, they hesitated the moment, stretching between them like a taut wire. "Thank you," April said again, her voice thick with meaning. Gilbert dipped his head, a small, almost embarrassed gesture. "Anytime," he said, and for once the words didn't feel like an empty courtesy. They felt like a promise. They parted ways outside the little diner as the city's evening lights flickered on beneath the bruised sky. Gilbert trudging back toward his old truck, and April sliding into her sedan with the drawing of Hugo tucked carefully into her purse. Yet, long after they left the warmth of the diner behind, neither of them could shake the sense that something important had shifted between them, something delicate and unfinished, like the first fragile layer of ice forming on a winter pond. It was the beginning of something neither dared name, yet a silent acknowledgement carried in the way their eyes had met and held just a little too long before they went their separate ways. The next morning, after a restless night spent replaying every word of their conversation, April sat at her wide desk on the 35th floor of Infinity Group's headquarters, staring out at the sprawling city below. She had meetings, scheduled calls to return contracts waiting for her signature, but none of it seemed to matter the way it had just a few days ago. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Gilbert, his quiet dignity, his straightforward way of speaking, the unpolished honesty that felt more valuable than any polished pitch she had heard in boardrooms. On impulse, she pulled out her laptop and began piecing together fragments of Gilbert's past from public records, construction permits, old online listings. What she found humbled her. Before life had knocked him down, Gilbert Brown had built schools, libraries, low-income housing developments, places that didn't just stand tall on steel and concrete, but pulsed with life because they had been designed with care for the people who would use them. His name appeared on structural engineering certificates for community centers, clinics, and shelters across the city, places that still stood still, served. She scrolled through faded news articles and grainy photos, absorbing every detail. No fancy degrees from Ivy League schools, no glossy resumes, just the kind of hard-earned, quietly given experience that no piece of paper could ever truly capture. It was as if every project he had touched had been a small rebellion against a world that often forgot the ones who needed it most. She leaned back in her chair, the decision forming slowly but solidly in her mind. Gilbert didn't just deserve help, he deserved the opportunity to help others again, not because he needed saving, but because perhaps more than anyone else she had ever met, he knew how to build, not just walls and roofs, but hope. Later that day, she called Gilbert, her voice steady, though her heart thudded with something that felt suspiciously like nervousness. "Would you meet me somewhere tomorrow?" she asked. Gilbert, cautious but curious, agreed. They met on a cold, bright morning, the sun glaring off the snow in painful brilliance. April picked him up in her car, and they drove in silence, neither speaking much, but the air between them, comfortable, weighted with expectation rather than tension. The car pulled up in front of a low brick building on the outskirts of the city, its paint peeling slightly, but the windows warm with light from within. A large wooden sign arched over the entrance, Allen's Place. Gilbert followed April inside the heavy door, creaking behind them. The scent of fresh coffee and old books wrapped around him instantly, along with something harder to define, a feeling of belonging, of safety. The walls inside were lined with colorful murals, handprints from children, framed photographs of families smiling in front of modest new homes, quotes about hope and kindness carefully lettered in bright paints. "This is Allen's Place," April said, her voice quiet but firm. "Named after the first person who ever made me believe I mattered." Gilbert turned to her, eyebrows lifting slightly in question, but he said nothing, sensing there was more she needed to say. "When I was 12, April began walking slowly down a hallway lined with crayon drawings and thank you cards. I ran away from a foster home. It was winter a night, a lot like the one we met. I ended up sitting on the steps of a church, cold scared, convinced no one would care if I just disappeared." She paused by a photo of a small girl bundled in an oversized coat, a shy smile barely visible. "Allen found me there," she continued, "an old man with hands like tree bark and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't ask what I was doing there. He didn't demand I explain myself. He just took off his coat and wrapped it around me. Then he sat next to me all night long without a word, just being there." Gilbert swallowed hard, something tightening in his chest he hadn't felt in a very long time. "That night," April said, turning to face him fully, "changed everything for me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. It was just someone deciding I was worth noticing, worth sitting beside." She gestured around them. "I built this place to pass that gift forward," she said simply, "and now I need help." Gilbert stood very still, the weight of her words settling over him like fresh snow. He could see it now, the why behind the polished woman who had stood in the snow that night and accepted a stranger's coat without protest. The scars she carried weren't visible, but they were there, stitched carefully beneath her confidence, her success. April took a breath, steadying herself. "I looked into your background," she admitted. "I know about the projects you built, the schools, the clinics, the housing developments. I know what you're capable of. And I know that people like you, people who build with more than their hands, who build with their hearts, are rare." Gilbert dropped his gaze, embarrassed but strangely touched. "I'm expanding Allen's place," April continued. "We're adding a new wing, more housing units, a new learning center. I need someone who understands what these places mean to the people who live in them. I need someone who doesn't just see walls and beams, but families and futures." She let the offer hang there, unforced. "I want you to join us as a technical advisor, help design it, help make sure it feels like home, not just another building." Gilbert's throat worked, but no words came out at first. He stared at the floor, then at the colorful drawings on the walls, then back at April, who waited without pressure, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her expression steady and open. "You really think someone like me?" He started, then shook his head. "I think someone like you," April said firmly, "is exactly who we need." The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was a silence filled with possibilities, not doubts. Finally, Gilbert nodded once short and sharp. "I'll think about it," he said. April smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. That's all I ask." They stood there a moment longer, surrounded by the warmth of Allen's place, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Gilbert felt something uncoil inside him. A slow, cautious bloom of something he had nearly forgotten how to feel. Hope. The decision to accept April's offer had not come lightly to Gilbert Brown. All night he had lain awake in the cab of his battered truck, staring at the frost-crusted ceiling, wrestling with fears he hadn't known he still carried. But when dawn's cold light slipped through the cracked windshield, he realized that maybe it was time at last to stop letting fear decide who he was. So he rose, brushed the snow from his shoulders, tucked the photograph of Lily and Hugo into his jacket, and made his way toward Allen's place, carrying with him nothing but a lifetime of hard-earned knowledge and the quiet, battered dignity that no storm had managed to strip from him yet. The first day at Allen's place was a blur of new names, blueprints spread across long tables, project plans pinned to corkboards, and technical discussions that buzzed with the clipped efficiency of people used to moving fast and expecting results. Gilbert listened more than he spoke, absorbing the rhythm of the team, the cadence of their concerns, the urgent tempo of schedules and deadlines. His new title, Construction Technical Advisor, felt almost too grand to him, but he wore it lightly, conscious that he was there to work to earn his place, not to parade it. Yet from the moment he set foot into the shared workspace, Gilbert could feel the invisible currents swirling around him, the glances that slid away too quickly when he turned his head, the careful politeness that somehow managed to be colder than open hostility, the way conversations paused just a beat too long when he joined a circle, only to resume in tones slightly too forced, slightly too bright. It wasn't overt. No one said anything cruel, at least not where he could hear it clearly. It was the small things, the almost invisible signals of a room quietly questioning his right to be there. Gilbert recognized it instantly, not because he was paranoid, but because he had lived long enough to know that prejudice rarely shouted anymore. It whispered. It lingered in the corners of boardrooms and break rooms, cloaked itself in words like concern and professionalism and fit. More than once, he caught snatches of conversations not meant for his ears. Crazy right special treatment because he gave the boss a jacket. I had to grind through 3 interviews just to get an unpaid internship here. I mean, no offense, but look at him. No degree from Stanford, no MBA, nothing. And you know, they love to make it about charity cases now. The unspoken "they" curled like smoke between the words, heavy with meaning, that needed no further explanation. Gilbert didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing whether their words found their mark. Instead, he focused on the work, the feel of blueprints under his fingers, the precision of measurements, the quiet, relentless satisfaction of solving real problems with his mind and hands. He reviewed design proposals, pointed out practical improvements, suggested cost-saving materials that didn't sacrifice warmth or dignity. His comments were simple, direct, always offered with respect. Some ignored him. Some nodded without really listening. But just a few paused, considered, made notes in the margins of their plans. April had made it clear from the beginning he wasn't there to make friends. He was there to build something that mattered. So he did. Still, some days were harder than others. There were afternoons when the weight of it all, the whispered doubts, the polite exclusion, the subtle questions etched into every sidelong glance pressed against Gilbert's ribs until he thought he might break. He knew what some of them saw when they looked at him, A black man past his prime, wearing second-hand boots and carrying no diploma. They respected a man who had no business walking the polished floors of Infinity's project offices. They saw an anomaly, a mistake, a curiosity brought in under the shield of April's favor. But they did not see Lily's hand in his, nor Hugo's laughter bouncing off the beams of houses he had once built. They did not see the long nights he had spent studying structural codes by the dim light of a shelter's common room, nor the mornings he had shaved in gas station bathrooms before walking into interviews where no one ever bothered to learn his name. They did not see a man who had lost everything and still chosen again and again to be kind. April saw it. That was enough. Still, by the end of his first week, there came a moment when Gilbert nearly walked away. It was late, most of the team already gone, the hallways quiet, except for the low hum of the cleaning crews. Gilbert sat at a drafting table, double-checking load-bearing calculations for a wing of Allen's place designed to house families with young children. As he worked, he overheard two junior architects outside the open doorway, voices too careless, too certain he wasn't paying attention. I mean, he's a nice guy, I guess, but let's be real. If it were any of us, we'd have to submit portfolios, references, go through rounds of interviews. He just walks in off the street and gets a title. Yeah, well. The other laughed quietly. Maybe I should go live in my car for a few years. Apparently, that's the new fast track to a promotion. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Gilbert stared down at the numbers on the page, the lines blurring for a moment. A deep, familiar ache twisted in his chest. Not just anger, though there was that, but an old, bitter cousin to it, weariness. He thought of the truck parked under a cracked streetlight 2 miles away, of the worn blanket waiting there, like an old friend of the way silence had wrapped around him for so many years that sometimes he almost mistook it for safety. Maybe they were right. Maybe he didn't belong here. He gathered his things slowly, methodically, preparing to slip out, to disappear, the way he had learned to do so well. But before he could leave, a quiet knock sounded at the doorframe. April stood there, a cardboard coffee cup in each hand, her expression unreadable. "Late night?" she asked casually, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Gilbert hesitated, then nodded once. April set one cup down in front of him, took the chair opposite, and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She didn't speak for a long moment, letting the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of the city fill the silence. Finally, she said, "You know, when I started this company, no one thought I belonged either." Gilbert blinked, caught off guard. April smiled faintly without bitterness. "Young, female, no pedigree, no powerful family name. Just me and a stupid idea that maybe success didn't have to come at the cost of decency." She sipped her coffee, then set it down carefully. "There were days I sat in rooms full of people who made it clear I wasn't welcome, who thought I was a joke, who waited for me to fail." She met his eyes steadily. "You stayed in that storm to give someone a coat who couldn't pay you back. You stood alone. That's more courage than most people here have ever had to show." She tapped the blueprint lightly with one fingertip. "And you're building something that will shelter hundreds of people who have nowhere else to go. Don't you dare let them shame you out of it." Gilbert felt the words land somewhere deep, somewhere bruised and aching, and still, somehow, fiercely alive. He picked up his pencil again, setting it firmly to the page. April smiled, rising without another word, and left him to his work. Gilbert stayed until well past midnight, his calculations neat and precise, the weight on his shoulders somehow lighter, though the city outside remained just as cold. And for the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to believe maybe belonging wasn't something you waited for others to grant you. Maybe belonging was something you built for yourself, one quiet, stubborn brick at a time. Winter tightened its grip on the city, the streets shimmering under layers of ice, the winds carving sharp paths between the high towers and the old brick facades alike. Yet inside Allen's place, a quiet kind of spring had begun to take root. Gilbert Brown moved through the halls like a man rediscovering not just work, but purpose, his steady presence becoming as much a part of the place as the worn floorboards and the bright murals that lined the walls. Every day, he built a little more, not just in blueprints and beams, but in trust in belonging. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, the doubts that had once clung to him like second skin began to fall away, leaving something sturdier, something earned. It was in the midst of this slow, stubborn rebuilding that another door opened. With a steady job, secured a modest but clean apartment rented with help from Alan's Place outreach, and a new rhythm of life taking shape, Gilbert had dared to begin the process of bringing his son home. The paperwork had been daunting, the interviews grueling, the home visits thorough, to the point of feeling invasive, but Gilbert bore it all without complaint. He knew what he was fighting for. And when the call finally came, the caseworker's voice, soft but firm, telling him that the board had approved his petition, he sat in silence for a long moment, the receiver pressed to his ear, before whispering a simple hoarse, "Thank you." Hugo arrived on a Saturday afternoon, a duffel bag slung over his narrow shoulders, his gaze wary but not unfriendly. He was taller now, his voice deeper, but the shape of his eyes, the stubborn tilt of his jaw, were echoes of a boy Gilbert remembered tucking into bed years ago, whispering promises into the dark that he had barely dared hope he could keep. Their reunion was quiet. No tears or grand declarations, just a nod, a half smile, and a long, fierce hug that said more than words could manage. They were strangers and family, all at once, two people stitching together a bridge across the time and pain that had separated them. Gilbert gave Hugo the bedroom, claiming the pull-out sofa without a second thought. They stocked the kitchen together, their cart at the grocery store filled with practical choices, beans, rice, pasta, and a few indulgences slipped in when they thought the other wasn't looking. The apartment was small and worn, the radiator clanking with a life of its own, but it was theirs. At night, they ate together at the little table, knees bumping under the scarred wood, sharing stories and fits, and starts building a new language between them. It was not easy, not seamless, but it was real, and real was more than enough. It was during one of these evenings, after a dinner of overcooked spaghetti and garlic bread, toasted a little too dark, that Gilbert found himself inviting April to join them. He wasn't sure why at first, maybe because he wanted to thank her, maybe because he wanted her to see the life she had quietly helped rebuild, or maybe because deep down he wanted to see how her laughter might sound in the small kitchen he was beginning to call home. April accepted without hesitation, arriving with a bakery box in hand and a bottle of inexpensive red wine tucked under her arm. She wore jeans and a soft sweater, her hair pulled back simply. And when she stepped into the apartment, bringing with her a gust of cold air and the faint scent of vanilla, it felt less like an intrusion and more like the missing piece of a puzzle sliding into place. Dinner was noisy, awkward, and perfect in its imperfection. Hugo, initially reserved, warmed quickly to April's easy conversation, her genuine interest, her ready laughter. Gilbert watched them, a quiet warmth blooming in his chest, careful not to let it show too much. He knew his place. April was engaged, her life entangled with another man's dreams, another man's expectations. He had no right to the flicker of hope he felt when she smiled across the table, no right to the way his heart tightened when she praised the meal, her eyes crinkling at the corners. For her part, April was careful too. She laughed and talked and asked Hugo about school, about sports, about the music he liked, but she kept a polite distance from Gilbert, as if sensing that anything more would be dangerous, unfair. Yet even with all her carefulness, she could not entirely shield herself from the feelings stirring inside her. Watching Gilbert joke quietly with his son, seeing the way he listened, truly listened to every word Hugo spoke, April felt a longing so deep, so visceral, it left her breathless. It was this, the messy, unvarnished, beautiful reality of family, of belonging, of coming home to something and someone that asked nothing more of you than your presence. She realized with a kind of quiet shock that she had never had this. Not really. Her life with Delbert was a well-oiled machine, sleek and efficient, all polished surfaces and calculated affection. They had plans, investments, strategies. But there were no burnt garlic breads, no off-key jokes about algebra homework, no spontaneous smiles caught across a battered kitchen table. There was no room for mistakes, for messy, glorious imperfection. And standing there, plate in hand, watching Hugo lean against his father's shoulder, laughing at some shared joke, April knew she would trade every glossy photograph, every magazine cover interview, every gala award for the chance to belong to a moment like this. But she said nothing. She smiled. She laughed when appropriate. She helped clear the dishes and praised Hugo's choice of dessert. When it was time to leave, she pulled on her coat, hugged Hugo goodbye, and thanked Gilbert warmly, sincerely. No lingering glances, no accidental touches, no whispered admissions. She kept her heart carefully tucked away, where it could not betray her, where it could not reach for something she had no right to claim. At the door, there was a pause, a space so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not standing within it. Their eyes met, and in that moment 1,000 words passed between them. Gratitude, longing, caution, hope, and something deeper. Something neither dared name, yet something that burned quietly, beneath the surface like embers waiting for a spark. Gilbert nodded a small, respectful gesture that spoke of all the things he could not say. April returned the nod, her hand tightening briefly on the doorknob. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hall, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but full, brimming with possibilities too fragile yet to touch. Inside, Gilbert closed the door gently, resting his forehead against the cool wood for a moment, breathing in the lingering scent of vanilla and cinnamon, and the faintest trace of something sweeter still, hope. He would not rush this. He would not tarnish what was unfolding with impatience or selfishness. Some things were too precious to grasp too quickly. Some things needed to be built with the same care and patience as the walls he now spent his days raising layer by layer, brick by brick, until they could shelter a future worth believing in. And so, in the small apartment, warmed by the laughter of a boy who had come home and the presence of a woman who unknowingly had begun to light the dark corners of his heart, Gilbert waited. The night after the dinner at Gilbert's apartment, April Jones sat alone in her penthouse, the lights of the city sprawling beneath her like a glittering sea. She no longer wanted to sail. The apartment was immaculate, each piece of furniture chosen for style and function, each surface gleaming under soft recessed lighting, each room a testament to success, carefully constructed and impeccably maintained. Yet tonight, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, April saw it all for what it was: sterile, impersonal, hollow. She wandered from room to room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors, her hands trailing over the smooth, cold surfaces of marble countertops and glass tables, and felt a profound emptiness echo back at her from every polished surface. She thought of the cramped kitchen in Gilbert's apartment, the laughter that had bounced off the scuffed walls, the easy, unforced warmth that had filled the small space more completely than any amount of designer decor ever could. She thought of Hugo's shy smile, of Gilbert's quiet pride, of the way the three of them had moved around each other with a kind of natural, unstudied grace that spoke of belonging, of being seen and accepted without needing to prove anything. And she realized with a pang so sharp it left her breathless that she had never truly had that, not with Delbert, not in any of the carefully curated relationships that had marked her adult life. What she had built was impressive, certainly, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten how to build something that mattered. She pushed the thoughts away, or tried to focusing instead on the evening ahead. Delbert had arranged for dinner, a rare break in his increasingly relentless schedule of meetings, mergers, and conference calls. He had texted her the address earlier, a new restaurant downtown renowned for its exclusivity and minimalist approach to fine dining. April changed into a sleek black dress, applied her makeup with mechanical precision, and descended into the night, telling herself that the hollow feeling would dissipate once she was back in the world she had fought so hard to belong to. The restaurant was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are. Muted, lighting pristine white tablecloths, an air of hushed reverence, more fitting for a museum than a place meant for sharing meals. Delbert was already seated when she arrived, his suit perfectly tailored, his phone resting face down on the table as a gesture of courtesy that somehow still felt performative. He rose, kissed her cheek briefly, and pulled out her chair with a practiced flourish that left her feeling more like a client than a fiancé. They ordered wine, something imported and aged, and Delbert launched into a detailed recounting of his latest boardroom victories. April listened politely, nodding at the appropriate intervals, offering murmurs of approval where expected. She waited for him to ask about her day, about her work at Alan's place, about anything personal, but the question never came. Instead, he spoke of IPOs and market shares of expansion plans and projected revenues, his words crisp and efficient, each sentence a bullet point in a presentation she had not asked to attend. Midway through the meal, in a lull between discussions of asset diversification and property acquisitions, April ventured a topic of her own. "I met someone recently," she said, keeping her tone light. "A boy, 15. His name's Hugo." Delbert looked up from his wine glass, mildly interested. "Through the foundation." "Sort of," April said. "He's the son of a man working with us at Alan's place. They've had a rough few years, but they're rebuilding their life. It's inspiring, really." Delbert smiled, a tight, polite thing that didn't reach his eyes. "That's nice," he said. "Always good to see people pulling themselves up." April hesitated, then pressed on, needing to say it aloud, needing to hear his response. "Spending time with them, it made me think about family, about what it means to have a home, not just a house." Delbert's expression shifted just slightly, his features tightening, as if she had suggested something mildly distasteful. He set down his fork with deliberate care. "April," he said, his voice calm, measured. "We've talked about this. Our lives are complicated enough without adding unnecessary burdens. Children, family obligations, their distractions. We have a trajectory, a plan. You knew that when you agreed to marry me." She sat very still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, every muscle in her body aching with the effort of maintaining composure. "I know," she said quietly. "I just thought, maybe there's room for both. Success and something more." Delbert shook his head, a faint frown creasing his brow. "There isn't. Not if you want to keep climbing. Not if you want to win." He leaned back in his chair, surveying her as one might assess a stock portfolio, weighing risk against reward. "We're building something that will outlast us. Legacy, April. Impact. Not family dinners and science fairs." For a moment, April couldn't breathe. She stared at him, at the man she had promised to build a life with, and saw not a partner, not a companion, but a strategist, a tactician. A man who viewed love and loyalty as assets, to be leveraged liabilities to be managed. She thought of Gilbert again, unbidden the way he had looked at Hugo, not as an obligation, but as the best part of himself. She thought of the warmth of that small apartment, the laughter, the life pulsing in every cracked tile and worn piece of furniture. And she realized with a clarity that left her reeling that she wanted no part of the life Delbert was offering. But she said nothing. Not yet. Instead, she smiled polite and practiced and finished her meal, her heart breaking silently inside her chest. Later, as she rode the elevator up to her apartment, the city lights blurring into a smear of gold and blue. Beyond the glass, April pressed her forehead against the cool wall and closed her eyes. She knew what she had to do, but knowing was not the same as being ready. Not yet. For now, she would carry the weight of her own awakening alone, nursing the fragile, aching seed of hope that had taken root inside her heart, waiting for the moment when she would be strong enough to choose the life she had glimpsed across a battered kitchen table, the life she truly wanted, the life she was beginning slowly, painfully to believe she deserved. It was the kind of evening that should have felt like the start of forever. The restaurant sat perched high above the city, its windows offering a sweeping view of the skyline wrapped in the blush of sunset. Candlelight flickered softly across polished silverware. Live jazz floated gently from a corner stage, and the maitre d' had greeted her by name with a smile that said, "This is a special reservation, the kind you don't forget." April Jones, dressed in a sleek ivory gown that shimmered subtly under the low light, was aware of it all, the elegance, the spectacle, the quiet expectancy of the other diners glancing over now and then. But none of it seemed to touch her. It was like watching a film she had seen too many times before. Beautiful, but distant, all surface and no soul. Delbert sat across from her, impeccably dressed in a deep navy suit, his posture perfect, his smile polished to a fine sheen. He had been unusually attentive all evening, asking about her latest projects, complimenting her choice of wine, brushing his fingers lightly over her hand as he spoke. It was by all accounts a perfect date. And April, who had once dreamed of moments just like this, found herself unable to breathe beneath the weight of its perfection. When dessert arrived, a sculpted chocolate confection topped with gold leaf, Delbert reached into his jacket pocket with the kind of practiced ease that suggested this gesture had been rehearsed more than once. The room quieted slightly, not with drama, but with polite anticipation. And then he was kneeling beside the table, a small velvet box in hand, the city lights painting his face with 1,000 reflections. "April," he said, his voice warm, confident, composed. "We've built something extraordinary together, a life rooted in vision, discipline, success. You are brilliant, driven, compassionate. You're everything I've ever wanted in a partner. I want to share everything with you, every challenge, every triumph, every milestone. Let's take the next step. Let's make this official." He opened the box. Inside, nestled against black velvet, sat a diamond that could have paid for an entire wing at Alan's place. Around them, a few gasps of admiration fluttered from nearby tables. The room leaned in, waiting for the nod, the kiss, the applause. April didn't move. Her breath caught in her throat, not from emotion, but from something closer to suffocation. She looked at the ring, at Delbert's steady eyes, at the way his smile seemed already prepared for a photo opportunity, and felt a strange rising detachment, as though she were floating above her own life, watching someone else inhabit her skin. This was the moment. The one every magazine profile would reprint, the one that would be replayed in slideshows at galas, anniversaries, interviews. But as the seconds ticked by, a deep and certain stillness settled in her chest. She thought of Gilbert not as a replacement, not as some romantic foil, but as a counterpoint. She thought of the rough warmth in his voice when he spoke to Hugo, the way his eyes crinkled with quiet joy when something simple went right, the way he listened, truly listened, without needing to prove anything in return. She thought of the way he had given her his coat that night, not knowing her name or her wealth, only that she was cold. And she thought of Hugo's laughter, the way it had filled that small apartment like music no orchestra could match. None of that existed in Delbert's world. Not because he was cruel, but because he simply didn't believe in it. To him, love was a construct, efficient, useful, logical. It had its place like a well-written contract, but it had no mystery, no mess, no room for broken edges and second chances. April looked at the ring again, and then gently she placed her hand over the box, closing it. Delbert's smile faltered. "Del," she said quietly, her voice steady, almost too calm. "You're offering me everything I thought I wanted, but not what I need." A hush fell over the table. Delbert's expression shifted not to anger, not yet, but to something harder. Calculation. Control slipping through fingers used to holding tight. "I don't understand," he said carefully, like someone trying not to tip a glass of wine. "We're a team. We have everything lined up, the properties, the launch, the timeline." This was the next logical step. April nodded slowly. "And that's exactly the problem. It's all logical, but I'm not in this anymore. Not in the way you are." He leaned back slightly, his jaw tight. "Is there someone else?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "There's something else," she said. "A life that feels like life. A version of me that remembers how to laugh without thinking about the next quarterly review." Delbert's face hardened. "You're walking away from everything we've built." "I'm walking toward something I forgot I deserved," she replied softly. For a moment, silence held them both thick and fragile. Then Delbert stood, slipping the box back into his pocket, his movements sharp, now mechanical. "You'll regret this," he said, not cruelly, not even with venom, just with the cold certainty of a man who had always assumed he knew how stories were supposed to end. April didn't respond. She simply rose, retrieved her coat, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Outside, the night was cold and bracing. The wind tore through the streets, tugging at her coat, biting at her cheeks, but it felt cleaner somehow, like stepping out of a sealed room into air that carried the scent of something new. She didn't know what would come next. She wasn't thinking about Gilbert, not directly, and she certainly wasn't crafting fantasies of what might be. All she knew was that she had finally listened to the quiet voice that had been whispering inside her since that night at the bus stop. The voice that said, "This isn't home. This isn't who you are. This isn't love." She walked for blocks, not toward anything specific, just away from what no longer fit. The streetlights flickered above her like soft beacons, and somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played a mournful, wandering tune that matched the rhythm of her heart. When she finally reached her building, she stood in the lobby, a long moment, looking at her reflection in the gleaming marble floor. The woman staring back at her looked the same, but inside something had shifted, something had realigned. 3 days passed before April returned to Alan's place. She hadn't planned for it to take that long, but after walking out of the restaurant that night, past Delbert's stunned expression and the silent spectators, she needed to sit with herself. Not to mourn what she'd left behind. She knew now that nothing real had been lost, but to be sure that what pulled her forward wasn't just relief or loneliness or rebellion. She wanted clarity. She owed that not just to herself, but to the man whose quiet generosity had cracked her armor and reminded her what love might look like when it wasn't dressed in ambition. It was early morning when she arrived. The halls of the community center were quiet, still filled only with the soft hum of radiators and the occasional echo of a voice from the front desk. She wasn't wearing heels or a suit, just a soft gray sweater jeans and boots that crunched slightly against the grit near the entrance. In her arms, she carried the coat, not in a bag, not folded away like a debt to be returned. She held it like something sacred, like a page in a book she had finally understood. Gilbert was in the workshop, head bent over a set of insulation samples, comparing density ratings on a clipboard. When she appeared in the doorway, he looked up slowly, not startled, just still. He set the clipboard down carefully and straightened. Their eyes met in a quiet that felt fuller than words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. April stepped inside, holding the coat against her chest, like it might still carry the warmth of that night. "I said no to him," she said softly. "Not because of you. Because I finally remembered who I am." Gilbert nodded once the movement barely perceptible. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer congratulations or comfort. He just stood there, grounded and steady, as if he had known somehow that she would find her way here in her own time. "I wanted to give this back," April said, offering the coat forward. "Not because I don't want it anymore, but because I want to carry it differently now. Not as something I needed, but as something I choose to remember." Gilbert took the coat, his fingers brushing hers, only for a second long enough to feel the tremor, the sincerity, the weight behind what she had said. "You're not just remembering," he said, his voice low and even. "You're rebuilding." She smiled, then not the poised public smile she wore in boardrooms or at benefit dinners, but something smaller, more vulnerable. "I hope so." And that was enough for now. What followed wasn't a grand reunion or a dramatic declaration. There were no sudden embraces, no promises carved in stone. April didn't move in. Gilbert didn't rush to change his schedule. They didn't label what was happening between them. Instead, they began to see each other not every hour, not always alone, but often in small moments that began to stitch themselves into something whole. They started having lunch together at the little cafe across from the center, seated at a corner table, with creaky chairs and excellent grilled cheese. Sometimes they talked about Hugo, sometimes about floor plans, sometimes about nothing at all. Their conversations meandered like gentle rivers, unhurried, unforced, and yet they always seemed to land somewhere meaningful. Hugo noticed first. He wasn't a child anymore, but he had a teenager's radar for unspoken truths. One afternoon after April had dropped by with fresh bagels and a new book for the community reading shelf, Hugo cornered his dad in the kitchen. "You smile more when she's around," he said simply, spooning peanut butter onto toast. Gilbert raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" Hugo shrugged. "You laugh at stuff that isn't even funny." Gilbert smiled, a little embarrassed. "She's easy to talk to." "Yeah," Hugo said, and there was something thoughtful in the way he said it, like he was giving permission without needing to say the words. A week later, the three of them went to the botanical gardens on a whim. It wasn't planned, just a warm Saturday, a clear sky, and the need to be somewhere that felt like spring in the middle of winter. They walked through the glass-domed greenhouses together, marveling at orchids and towering ferns, laughing over Hugo's exaggerated impressions of tour guides. Gilbert and April stayed close but never touched, yet somehow their nearness spoke louder than proximity ever could. Later, as the sun dipped low and they sat on a bench sharing warm pretzels and watching kids feed ducks in the pond, Hugo turned to April with a shy grin. "I wish you could come to dinner more," he said. "It feels better when you're there." April blinked, caught off guard. "That's sweet of you." "No, I mean it," Hugo continued. "It's like, more like home." The words settled in her chest with a weight she wasn't expecting. She glanced at Gilbert, who was looking down, pretending to fuss with a napkin, but she could see it, the emotion swimming just below the surface. That night, April did have dinner with them again. Nothing fancy, just grilled chicken salad and store-brand ice cream with chocolate syrup. But she stayed afterward to help wash dishes, drying plates, while Gilbert rinsed trading stories about failed cooking experiments and childhood chores. Hugo sat at the kitchen table doing homework, occasionally chiming in with a joke or a question. It wasn't special, and yet it was. They were becoming something. Not quite a couple, not yet a family, but something. Gilbert, for his part, remained careful. Not distant, never that, but thoughtful, measured, as though he understood how fragile this was, how much it mattered to move slowly, to let trust and comfort grow in real time. He didn't reach for her hand when they walked. He didn't lean in when they stood close, but he listened. He remembered details. He laughed with her, not at her. And every now and then, when he thought she wasn't looking, he would smile in that quiet way that made her feel completely, utterly seen. April didn't need declarations. She didn't need fanfare. What she needed was what Gilbert gave her: consistency, honesty, a place where she could set down her armor and simply be. She found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, talking about her past, her fears, the pressure to be everything for everyone. And Gilbert, in his quiet strength, never tried to fix her. He just listened, as if that in itself was enough. The days that followed were quieter, gentler, as if life had slipped into a new rhythm, unspoken, but understood. There was no dramatic shift, no big announcements or labels suddenly pinned to feelings. Instead, there was presence. April showed up sometimes with breakfast, sometimes with a new idea for a reading nook at Alan's place, sometimes with nothing but a quiet smile, and Gilbert let her in. Not just into his home, but into the growing space of his days. The space that for so long had been carved only for survival now had room for coffee cups and shared silence, for 3 sets of shoes at the door instead of 2, for the soft sound of April's voice humming while drying dishes she hadn't been asked to touch. Gilbert hadn't known how much he needed it. He'd spent so long carrying the weight of the world in fragments, always holding it together, just enough for Hugo's sake, that when the weight began to lift, he didn't trust it at first. He kept expecting the sky to fall again. But each morning that passed without crisis, each evening that ended with warmth instead of worry, chipped away at his fear. It wasn't that the past had disappeared. The ache of losing Lily still lived in him, quiet and steady, but it had softened somehow, like a bruise finally healing beneath the skin. And in its place, something new was growing. Something scarier, perhaps, because it was unfamiliar, but also something worth leaning into. April didn't push. That was what made it possible. She never asked him to be more than he was in that moment. She didn't speak of the future in grand sweeping terms. She didn't try to define what they were. She simply met him where he stood every time, with grace, with patience, with a steadiness that mirrored his own. When they spoke of their pasts, it wasn't to compare pain, but to share understanding. One night, as they sat on the couch with mugs of chamomile tea and the soft murmur of the television in the background, April told him about the foster homes, the well-meaning strangers, the ache of waiting for someone to come back and realizing no one ever would. She didn't cry, and neither did he. But their hands found each other on the couch cushion between them, and they stayed there, held quiet, real. He told her about Lily in the same way, not as a wound, but as a woman who had mattered, who had taught him how to love, how to stay, how to keep showing up, even when the world gave you every reason not to. He didn't speak of her as someone to be mourned endlessly, but as someone whose memory could walk beside them without shadowing everything else. April listened not with jealousy or distance, but with the kind of compassion that asked nothing except the truth. It made Gilbert feel safer than he ever had before. Not long after April brought up the idea of a different apartment. It wasn't framed as a gift or a solution, just a thought. Something closer to Alan's place, something with more space. Something that felt less temporary, less like transition, and more like a beginning. Gilbert paused when she said it, not out of pride, but reflex. He had trained himself not to need more than the bare minimum, but the look in her eyes was not one of pity. It was hope, practical hope rooted in love that respected boundaries and still made room to grow. Think of it as a foundation, she said, her voice light but honest. Not a handout. Gilbert said he'd consider it, and within a week, he signed the lease on a 2-bedroom apartment just 5 blocks from the community center. It wasn't fancy, but it had wide windows that let in the morning sun and a little porch where Hugo could sit and read or play music. They painted the living room themselves with mismatched rollers and a color that looked different in every light, but felt right anyway. April helped them move in, but she didn't stay. Not yet. She understood that some spaces needed to belong to the two of them, first father and son, before she could belong too. But she did come for dinner. She came with homemade chili and cornbread wrapped in cloth. She came with board games and books and quiet stories about her week. And each time she left, Hugo would say, "You don't have to go, you know." And she'd smile, ruffle his hair, and say, "Maybe next time." It was Hugo in the end who said it first. They were sitting around the table one Sunday night, the remains of dinner scattered between them, empty bowls, crumbs, laughter hanging in the air like a warm blanket. Gilbert had just made a terrible pun. April groaned dramatically and Hugo rolled his eyes, then smiled at them both with a quiet kind of certainty. "I'm glad we're all together again," he said simply. "It feels like a family now." The room went still for a moment, not because anyone was shocked, but because the truth of it landed with such gentle weight. Gilbert looked at April. April looked at Hugo, and something unspoken passed between them all, something fragile and beautiful and whole. Later that evening, after Hugo had gone to bed, Gilbert and April stood by the kitchen window, looking out over the quiet street, the hum of the heater, the only sound between them. "I've never really called anything home before," April said softly. Gilbert turned to her, his voice low. "You could start here." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she placed her hand over his palm to knuckle, grounding him in something real. Then she looked up at him and said, with the gentleness of someone who wasn't asking, but stating a truth already known, "I'm not building alone anymore." He didn't speak either, just turned his hand and closed his fingers around hers. And just like that, what had been wordless found its name. They didn't rush into titles or rings or declarations. There would be time for that later. For now, there was this two people who had lost and learned and found their way back to the core of what it meant to care. And one young boy who had unknowingly bridged their hearts, made space for healing, and called it what it was: family.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.